I will introduce you. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hao Huang, Associate Professor of Social Sciences, and welcome to the Illinois Tech Social Sciences Greater Performance Great Minds seminar series. For today's seminar, we will open the floor to the questions at the end after the talk and lecture. Today's speaker, Dr. Shiode, is a senior lecturer in human geography and geographic information science in the Department of Geography, Geology, and the Environment at the School of Engineering and the Kingston University. He works mainly on the analysis and interpretation of changing patterns of risks as well as the formulation of crime intervention strategies and their policy implications. He has published 38 peer-reviewed journal articles in top journals such as Urban Geography, International Journal of Geographic Information Science, and Transaction in GIS. He has published 12 book. He also published 12 book chapters. His research has been supported by the British Academy and the National Trust, the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science, and the Japan Science and Technology Agency. The past projects have been led mainly through collaboration with the partners, such as the London Milestone Office, the Westminster City Council, Jackrow Land Rover, and the National Health Service. Dr. Shiode holds a PhD in built environment from University College London, University of London, and a master's degree and a bachelor degree in urban engineering from the University of Tokyo. He has previously taught at the State University of New York at Buffalo, Cardiff University, Warwick University, and the King's College in London. It's very glad to welcome Dr. Shiode, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for that very grand introduction. I don't know what to say after that. Let me just share my screen.
I will give you the.
Okay.
I'm gonna give you the. Let me give you the
sharing privilege.
Yeah. Now you can share it. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. Right. So I'm hoping you can see my screen.
Yeah, you can see. Yes.
Yeah. And I'll probably turn off my sad self so that you can focus more on the presentation. Now, okay, so this is pretty much a collaboration between my wife and myself. My wife teaches at Birkbeck College, which is also part of University of London. It's an evening taught college, and because we actually live in Cambridge, she normally arrives at around midnight by the time she gets home. So she can't be here in person today, but pretty much everything that I talk about today is based on the collaboration between the two of us. So her name's there. So today I'd like to talk about some new approaches to exploring the spatial and the temporal patterns of crime. Now, this may not be even necessary after that ground introduction, but just very briefly, I used to teach at the State University of New York at Buffalo, which is where I met Professor Huang. And yeah, I've been to a few workplaces, and about 2 years ago, I became ill during the COVID period. And at the moment, I'm taking a sort of easy job down in Kingston. My wife also teaches in the similar domain. So we're mainly spatial analysts. And I was looking at the papers that we published in the last 14 months or so, and the ones highlighted in white are the ones that are directly relevant to the topic of crime and security. What we're looking at here is we're looking at a geography of crime as a concept that we try to capture through the dimension of spatial distribution and temporal distribution. Now, the prospective users and the utility of these understanding of geography of crime would be the police departments. At the moment, we work closely with London Metropolitan Police Service, and their specific demands are to evaluate the impact of policing, as in stop and search operation, intensive policing in high-risk areas, and then see whether that was cost effective. There are also resource management problems, such as changing the patrol patterns, the frequency thereof, officer dispatch in response to urgent calls, operating drones. Drones is a particularly interesting example, which is something we're experimenting with the Greater Manchester Police at the moment. Also assisting in decision-making and daily briefing. But this is something that we have started to trial with a regional police force called the West Mercia Police, which is sort of in close to Birmingham, let's put it that way. So very, very to the west. And it also produces some daily reports, which local commanders can then debrief to their troopers. Now, sorry. We also work with policymakers and local authorities, including London Mayor's Office. There's a unit called London Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime, who governs the fund for the Metropolitan Police Service, and they effectively decide how often we do the stop and search and where to do it. So we work closely with them in terms of resource planning, crime prevention by design, also promoting safety. In fact, sorry, I'm going back, but one of the papers on understanding the public confidence in the police within the changing crime landscape, that's a bit of a mouthful, but Paul Dawson is the head of Insight team at London Mayor's Office. So we work quite closely with these stakeholders, not necessarily academics, but they provide us with interesting insights, which we wouldn't have normally come across in an academic context. And of course, there are interests among security firms, insurance industry, about where to look for and what values to assign in terms of the risk assessment for each respective neighborhood. Okay, so today I'd like to discuss the 3 topics, but mainly focus on the first one and then give you a taster of 2 other topics. And for those of you who just joined us, my name is Narushige. I work on the spatial and temporal analysis of crime. Now, the first topic is about detecting a small crime hotspot as accurately as possible. Now, you might think this is quite straightforward. And let me explain what a hotspot is and what hotspot policing does. It's a targeted patrolling and intervention at high-risk locations, and it's important because it's known to be particularly effective for reducing crime. Now, it's been known that about 50% of crimes recorded in any city occurs in just about 5% of the streets in those cities. And this is statistically true. It varies from city to city. So for instance, in Atlanta, I believe it was about 4.4%. In Chicago, it's somewhere between 5% and 6%. But in other words, if you think of the 6% of the most high-risk streets in Chicago, then they are likely to host about 50% of the crimes recorded annually. So that's quite a big number, because if we target those streets, then at least we would be reducing crime. But bearing in mind, of course, if we do target those high-risk places, occasionally the criminals would go to the next street or a nearby neighborhood and repeat the crime. This is known as crime displacement. We'll come back to that. But yes, by and large, targeting these high-risk areas tend to be effective in reducing crime. And this is why strategic intervention at these high-risk locations could greatly reduce the overall crime rates. And by the way, I do sort of talk through the slides, but if you have any questions, please just cut in. Okay, so the first data set is, I'm afraid it's ancient. It's back from back in 2000, and this is something that I've worked on in collaboration with someone from University of Loyola, I believe it was, and also someone from Illinois Criminal Justice Department. We looked at the neighborhood of West Englewood because that area did have quite high volume of crime. The population was already diminishing as of then, down to about 45,000 people. As of today, I believe it's less than 30,000 people, which is quite vacant, I should say. Now, I've actually never been there. I've only strolled on Google Street View, as we would, but I've heard a lot about the neighborhood and the characteristics thereof from my colleagues. And so, in principle, we selected area that was that has lots of crime incidents, and we focused on 4 types of crimes. One is drug-related arrests. The next one is robberies. Then comes the residential burglaries. And the last one is, it says vehicle theft, but it's actually theft from vehicle. So yeah, if you think 520 cars were stolen, that's not correct. Okay, so if we just look at burglary cases, robbery cases, and the theft from vehicle, and I think I may have had some cheesy images. Apologies, and I did not ask for copyright permission, I'm afraid. This is something that I used to give a demo at my son's local high school, really. So yeah, it's breaking and entering for stealing, robbing someone by force, and so on. It gives a more intuitive explanation, and I also got rid of the drug-related arrests so that it would be a bit milder, sort of PG-13. Anyway, if you look at these 3 maps, they're obviously looking at the same, we're obviously looking at the same area, we're looking at the same ear, but there are some patterns. Now, if you look at the robbery cases, we can clearly see that they tend to concentrate along the main boulevards. And I've been told that these are the places where the commercial facilities tend to concentrate, and robberies by far the most frequently targets commercial facilities, and hence the concentration there. Burglary seems to spread out quite a bit, and so does theft from vehicle. Now, on the surface, if we just compare these 3 maps, yes, there are some patterns that we can see in the robbery map, but we can't really say quantitatively what's where and how much concentration there is. So this is where the hotspot mapping becomes useful, because we can say, statistically speaking, something like this could be extracted. So what we're looking at here is the red road sections and the sort of weird shapes. They're showing us the areas that have unusually high concentration of certain crimes. And we say unusually high, as in something that couldn't have happened by chance. So this is where statistics comes into play. In order to derive this, essentially we would create lots and lots of random patterns of points. First, we count the number of points that are included in this map. We then replicate the street network. We then assign those number of points randomly across this study area. We then do that again for 1,000 times or 10,000 times so that we could create the base against which to compare the observation and then say, okay, this couldn't have really happened by chance because all across 10,000 iterations, it didn't look anything like this. So this is really the 1% chance of having such unusual concentration, if you will. And so if we get past that statistical testing bit, then this is how it looks. It still doesn't look significantly different, you might say, but there are some patterns starting to emerge. Now, to draw this map...
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
You said a 1% chance that it would look like this. You mean a 1% chance that it wouldn't look like this?
Sorry. So the 1% is a bit of a stretch, but if we say 99% of the time this shouldn't happen, then that's the sort of threshold that we use. In other words, if we had these patterns iterated, then 1 in 100 cases, this may still happen by chance. That's what it means.
Yeah,
so,
gotcha.
But so in other words, it's highly unlikely. Yeah. And of course, as with most statistical procedures, we could change that threshold to 0.5% or 0.1% or anything. By default, we normally use 1%. But yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Right. So in order to derive that, what we did was, this is something that my wife and I came up with. Network-based methods are now becoming more popular, but in those days, nothing of that kind was there. Well, hardly there. And what I mean by network-based pattern or network-based hotspot detection is that if we look at this particular point pattern, then if this was on a regular Euclidean space where we could just take a straight line to reach the next point, then we might say, okay, it looks like we have 2 clusters. But if this was actually along a very long winding street network, then it could be actually equidistant points. It's just that this is in a different dimension. It's on a network dimension rather than the Euclidean dimension. So depending on the map that we're looking at, the collection of observation points may or may not be accurately represented. And so it could be something like this, I suppose. Yeah. Again, if we look at something like this, it might seem as though there are patterns emerging, and we might say, okay, there may be some concentrations, and it looks to be of particular pattern. This is actually random distribution on a street network. I believe I took this from downtown Tokyo, I think. I'm not 100% sure, but yeah. Okay, so why is that important? Well, if we look at this particular case and say we're looking at these 2 points, if we measure the distance between these 2 sample cases, let's say these were 2 cases of residential burglary, then we might say, okay, this one and that one is sufficiently close by straight line. But in fact, unless the burglars were going over the fence in the backyard, they would normally travel across the street, along the street. So this would have been the total distance along the street network that they're traveling, in which case the risks of being burgled tend to be shared along the houses nearby. So this first house and the other house, they wouldn't necessarily share the same amount of risks. And so this is where we're coming from. We wanted to create a method that would accurately measure the clusters along the street network rather than allowing a sort of a ballpark estimate on the straight line distance. So to do that, rather than capturing a hotspot with what is known as search window, so a search window is like a circle or an ellipse or some other forms of aerial unit that we tend to sweep across the study area with. And then we try to understand where we have captured most statistically unusual concentration and then call that hotspot. But in our case, we defined a flexible subnetwork which could change shape, but it maintains the same length, the total length, and it just travels across the street network of the study area to capture the most unusual concentration. So the difference seems very subtle, but the result looks quite different. So the spatial search window typically would be a circular or ellipsoidal or something of an aerial unit. And this was originally developed by many people, including Stan Openshaw, Martin Kulldorff, and so many more. Then instead, we could create a subnetwork version which flexibly adapts its shape to the street network, street configuration, and then travels across the search. Now, we could also extend that to the temporal dimension. Let's say this voxel represents spatial and temporal distribution. The XY coordinates representing the spatial expanse, and then the vertical direction showing the temporal duration. Then by extending it to a cylindrical or a sort of a 3D version of the subnetwork, then we could create a space-time search window. So what then happens is, not only are we looking at concentration of cases, concentration of risks in space, but also in time. And this could be important because if there were cases of burglaries observed in one area, but many of them were spread across the year, then perhaps there may not be a concentrated burglary case in a short period of time. Whereas if we saw several cases emerging in a short period of time, then we actually have a space-time concentration and we may need to do something about it. So with that in mind, here's some understanding of the method that we produced and its accuracy. So we try to do a benchmark test. Now, doing a benchmark test against point pattern is actually not that easy. And the reason being, if we look at the real crime data, we can't really objectively say, okay, here is exactly where the cluster should be. Whereas if we created a simulated data, as in if we created our own data with a certain statistical pattern. So in other words, this image with the blue concentrated point on the left, the blue lines represent the areas where we intentionally injected points of significant concentration. So we controlled those significance, and the remaining points we randomly distributed following a Poisson distribution, pretty much random. And then against this distribution, because we now know where exactly the concentrations are, we can then use it as a benchmark test example specimen, shall we say. And we could do many of them. This is just one illustration. And then when we applied what is known as STAC, space-time analysis of crime, by Richard Block and Betsy block. This is the couple who actually, Richard used to teach at Loyola University, and Betsy used to be at Illinois Criminal Justice Department. The overall capturing is not too bad, but as you can see, sometimes it undershoots, sometimes it overshoots. So it's not entirely accurate. Our method, okay, it doesn't capture 100% because sometimes where there is still a statistically significant concentration or a part thereof, it might underestimate it, and then there might be a slight overestimation at the end. But by and large, when we tested it for certain iteration, it came up to about 98.5 to about 99% accurate. And that's a significant improvement to about 60 to 80%, depending on the method, but 60 to 80% accuracy of the existing method. So we were just chuffed, as in pleased about that. We did name it provocatively network stack, comparing ourselves to block and blocks stack. We published the paper. Next thing you know, Richard and Betsy get in touch with us, and we thought, oh dear, they're not going to like it because we didn't exactly ill-mouse their method, but we said comparatively our method is much better. Now it turns out they liked our paper, and then so we decided to work together, which is why we have access to that Chicago data, even though it's from 2000. So the paper was then published between Shiode, block and block, and we're now working with a couple from Jill Dando Institute at University College London, so we might make it a series. But anyway, so this is how we compare the performance of methods, especially when we propose a new one. And the same thing can be done against the famous scan statistic, which is a very famous method, popular method, used mainly in epidemiology. So what it's used for, it usually highlights the hotspot as in the highest risk location for COVID concentration and dengue fever and whatnot. This time, we not only looked at the comparative performance, we also looked at how sensitive the method was. And what we did, we added, so first we detected the most concentrated cluster, and then we started adding points to the second most concentrated cluster to the extent that it then becomes the most concentrated cluster. And sure enough, our method was very sensitive in reacting to that change, but scan statistic just ignored the change. So yeah, this is a bit of an advocate of our method, shameless sort of sales, I suppose. But what we're doing here is to verifying the validity of the method that we propose, because otherwise, you know, it wouldn't do to really propose a new method. Okay, so with that in mind, we again created some simulated concentrations varying the months of the year, and then repeated that. And so here's the space-time version of the surveillance, if you will. Surveillance as in finding day-to-day where the concentrations are and how significant they are. So the color that we see here represents the level of peculiarity or the degree of unusualness. The redder the color, the more peculiar or highly concentrated it is. And the greener it is, it will be closer to by chance, but just above the threshold, kind of mild unusualness. Okay, so again, we're looking at these spatial patterns, and then we think, okay, can we do the space-time concentration? Because if we look at the temporal concentration of crimes, for this area, West Englewood, then it's the exact same data set. We're just looking at drugs, burglary, theft from vehicle, and robbery. And as you can see, it's highly seasonal for some crimes, and then less so for other crimes. As you can tell, robberies and theft from vehicle tend to be aseasonal, whereas burglary and to an extent drug-related arrests, they're more prolific during the summer period. So if we compare the spatial hotspots against the spatial temporal hotspots, we now see a much clearer pattern. And what we're looking at here is we're projecting these, let me show you. We're projecting these concentrations onto the XY plane so that it looks as though it's a variation of this, but what it is, we're almost looking top down onto the spatial temporal clusters. So if we see anything green, that means at some point within year 2000, there was a significant spatial as well as temporal concentration observed in this area. And as you can tell, drug-related arrests seem to have almost a perpetual concentration. We call it hotbed in these areas. Now, I've been told by the block and block couple that they tend to happen just one street off the main boulevard because they don't want to be seen. They don't want to be too conspicuous, but at the same time, they want to be accessible for their customers. So they just stay one street off, or so I've been told. I don't know. I've never purchased anything. And so, yeah, this is just hearsay. Okay. As you can see, robbery still tends to happen and also seems to happen in a relatively short period of time. But burglary and vehicle theft from vehicle seems to have more sporadic pattern, shall we say. Now, this is burglary. As you can see, once we put it in a three-dimensional, as in spatial and temporal dimension, then we can clearly see burglary takes place very more often during the summer season. I've been told this is because in Chicago, and you can tell me if this is true or not, in Chicago during the winter season, it's very cold. There is lots of snow on the ground. I've been told it's colder than Buffalo. So that's saying something. Having lived in Buffalo, New York myself for about 5 years, yeah, I know how cold it can be. And so the burglars tend to be dormant. Whereas once we get to spring and then summer, obviously the snow's gone. So no evidence of footprints on the snow, and people tend to have doors and windows open, and you know, it's much easier to sneak in. Interestingly, in London, it's the complete opposite. During the summertime, there isn't, well, I mean, there's a fair amount of burglary, but there is not much of a concentration. It's mainly November and December. And the reason being, it's not terribly cold. There's usually no snow, but because it tends to get very dark very soon, people tend to get depressed and they don't walk around much. So there's less witnesses on the street. People tend to close their curtains. So once you're inside, it can take all the time in the world to, you know, do whatever business they need to attend to. Finally, the Londoners go really crazy with Christmas shopping to pamper themselves as well as distribute the presents and so on. So long story short, they have cash or presents, lots of them in houses. So from November to about early mid-December is when the burglars are most prolific in London. Yeah, that's just the local geography. Anyway, if we look at the robbery cases, then this is non-seasonal at all. And I don't know why. And perhaps these retail shops, they just go in and rob the unfortunate shopkeepers, regardless of the season, I suppose. A theft from vehicle, this is much more opportunistic, and so there is not much of a concentration. If there was, then it could be the case of broken street lamp or something else. Apparently, I've been told this is where the headquarters for this district is, and for the first few weeks, they kept a record of the impound vehicles here. So even if theft from vehicle happened elsewhere, if the ownership was unclear, then they registered it at the impound, and that's why there's concentration there. So in effect, this is pretty much a cluster-less pattern, as in no significant spatial temporal concentration, which obviously makes it difficult for the police force to respond to and prevent. Because if there were clear patterns or even seasonal pattern, then they could target those. Whereas if it's much more opportunistic, then all they can do is promote and enlighten the local citizens about the risks, and also to set up CCTVs, I suppose. But it's very difficult. Okay, so that's the sort of comparison between burglary cases, the drug-related arrests, robbery, and theft from vehicle in West Englewood area. Does anyone have any questions so far? Or maybe I should keep that until the end, I suppose. Yeah, okay, sorry.
Yeah, may I ask, just now you mentioned a table, a figure is called the threshold for like a drug threshold 9. What's that threshold means?
Okay, so for instance, here we're looking at the same threshold, as in, I believe it was a p-value of 0.01. So we just set up a statistical significance to see whether or not these couldn't have really happened by chance. And this is something that is highly unusual to the extent that we would call it statistical anomaly. So the threshold is something that we take as a default value, but we can obviously change that. So if we were to change that from p equals 0.01 to, let's say, 0.1, then we would be detecting many more concentrations, and we would call all of those as statistical anomalies. If, on the other hand, we tighten the threshold and go for, I don't know, p equals 0.001 or something, then we would be detecting very few concentrations, almost something like this for the drug cases. And these ones, I suspect they would just disappear. So it's more art than science when it gets to deciding on the threshold value. And this is not typically what the statisticians would like to admit, but statistics is actually a woolly subject, because they have all these fancy t-tests and chi-square tests and so on, but ultimately they're comparing it against certain threshold, which they typically select subjectively. So yeah, that's a very good point, because we're actually selecting a threshold value that we think works the best to be as sensitive but not too sensitive, if that makes sense.
What I'm asking is the figure. You have a figure is showing the yearly, the different days have the 4 crime, and also the 2, but only show 2 type of crime threshold. That figure for that is use the threshold is you mentioned like this 1% or for that figure?
Let me go back. Is it this one, or are we?
The figure you shows that the whole year, the dates, the date. Yeah,
This
the
one.
figure. Yeah, you have the burglary threshold and the drug threshold.
Oh, I see. Sorry. Yes. So this one is simply showing a threshold. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for pointing that out. This is actually a non-spatial temporal threshold. So what it is, if it's above this threshold value, that means it's sort of within the 1% of the whole concentration, the whole crime count. So this would be something that is really, really high, as in crime count in a short period of time. So this threshold is really one of those things which is quite arbitrary, but we just pay attention to these peaks. Yeah, that's all there is to it. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me just quickly go back, and then so this is pretty much an illustration of what we're exploring with some local police officers, the regional police forces in Britain at the moment. What it does, it captures and alerts the emergence of hotspots based on what's been happening till yesterday. So if there is a pattern of increasing crime cases in certain areas, then this system sort of preemptively say, okay, here's a case of increase in crime, and maybe we should look at this particular area today. And so this, we're now combining it with machine learning so that it would be easier and it would be operated automatically. And as we have more data set, then we sort of train it to refine it. But yeah, it seems to be a fairly useful tool for the local police forces. And so one of the regional police decided to use it for morning briefing, and we're due to go back to them to see how useful it proved to be. Bearing in mind, the police officers with many years of experience and the local knowledge may or may not entirely agree with these maps, because they would say, oh, no, this is not the case, because I know for a fact that that area is dangerous, and they would still go on to patrol some other areas, which is fair enough. But yeah, so we'll see how that goes. Okay, so that was the first topic, and I'll just quickly cover two more topics, and hopefully I would still have some time for questions. The second topic is about broken window theory. So I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but broken window theory is something quite simple. It's a metaphor for disorder within neighborhoods, and it links disorder and incivility within a community to subsequent occurrences. What it means is, if we see areas with some signs of neglect, such as literally broken window, graffiti on the wall, and maybe, you know, dusty streets, garbage on the streets, and pretty much sign of neglect, then there tends to be more serious crime to follow. So this has been a part urban myth, but also partly proven as a statistical pattern, where if there's lots and lots of signs of trouble in the area, then there tends to be serious crimes to follow in that area. Now, whether or not these visual signs of trouble is actually inviting these heavier and more sinister crime, or actually it's the case where the areas that is likely to incur some serious crimes are actually neglected, we're not sure. But in whichever direction it goes, typically it's the case where it starts with some various types of light crime, shall we say, not a serious crime. And then as we tend to have more and more of these and more types of these, then we tend to see more of the serious crimes as well. Now, what we were interested in was the pattern of this progression, and we wanted to see whether or not this is also statistically true. So to see the clusters of crimes and the collocation between different crime types, we first needed to define what clusters were and what collocations were. Clusters, it's pretty much the case where we look at, let's say, concentration of residential burglaries, concentrations of drug-related arrests, and so on. Collocation is a different notion. Collocation means we're looking at a group, a set of crimes. So there will be a membership to this particular group. It could be a combination of, let's say, drug-related arrests, burglary, and robbery. Let's say it's a set of 3 examples. Then we might find the same 3 crime types in some other places. And if we find the same pattern again and again, then we would say, okay, so these types of crimes actually tend to form a membership together, and it's a collocation. Now, what we're looking at is a combination of these two, as in concentration of certain types of crimes having a concentration of another crime in the vicinity. So we have a case of clusters of crime types being collocated, if that makes sense. So in other words, in this case, let's say the red dots were the residential burglary and the green squares were the drug-related arrests. Then we're looking at areas where residential burglaries are rife, tends to also have lots and lots of drug-related arrests. Now, obviously, that's hypothetical. Whether or not that's true is another question, but that's how we define the collocated clusters. So this is what we came up with, and we looked at a list of crimes recorded in Chicago. This is entire Chicago back in 2019, and we chose 2019 partly because from 2020 onwards, the crime data, the pattern thereof, it changed a lot because of COVID. So we're looking at 2019, which is relatively recent, and these are the types of crimes that were recorded across Chicago. And as you can see, certain types of assault, we categorize them in 3 different types, as in residential and indoor assault, which typically means domestic violence, assault in public buildings and commercial buildings, church, school, and so on, and assault in open space. And the same goes for battery, burglary, criminal damage, and then there are other types of crimes, including sexual assault, homicide, gambling, and so on. Now, obviously, some of these crimes were aspatial, as in non-spatial, and we excluded them. These were fraud cases and some other cases that were non-spatial, sometimes cyber crimes, which typically were non-geographical. So we excluded those and concentrated on crimes that tend to take place in the real geography. Now, here we're looking at, this looks archaic, but what we're showing here is a membership of the crime types and the significant clusters that we see within each of the community areas in Chicago, and see which combination of crimes actually occur in each community area. And if we see the same pattern happening again and again, then we might say, aha, that's a sort of established set So here, for instance, we seem to see these four happening relatively frequently. So these four happens to be from assault 1, 2, 3 to burglary, that's residential burglary. So that seems to suggest that areas where we see lots of assault cases, whether it's domestic or in public place or in open space, tends to also have lots of burglary cases. That's residential burglary versus the commercial burglary. Okay, so we then try to understand whether or not there is an emerging pattern, the growth of these membership, as in areas with less number of crimes then start to form a collocation with some additional crimes, and it then keeps growing and growing. And so we wanted to see whether there was a clear pattern of the growing membership of the crime types, crime sets, as it were. And so this is not very intuitive diagram, but perhaps this one is. So we summarized the pattern that we extracted in this analysis, where the primary set, if you will, consists of the residential assault and residential battery. These are typically to do with domestic violence, unfortunately. And then comes the battery in open space, criminal damage to property. Now, once we see many of these cases, then we tend to start seeing the secondary types of crimes joining into this area. And that's motor vehicle theft, criminal damage to vehicle, robbery in open space, theft from residential space, assault in open space, criminal trespassing, weapons violation. And again, once we see a combination of these primary collocation and the secondary collocation, that's when we see more serious crimes, as in homicide, narcotics, criminal sexual assault, and so many more. So that's the sort of broken window theory by our interpretation. Now, there were also non-collocating crimes, partly because they were quite rare, and these included arson, kidnapping, stalking, sex offense, and so on. So not all crimes do collocate with other crimes, but there was a clear pattern of collocation. Okay, so maybe for the last 5 minutes, I'll talk a little bit about seasonality of crime, fluctuation of crime volumes, and the resonance between different crimes. Now, the crimes do show seasonal fluctuation in their volume. Some of them more so, others are aspatial. And it's been studied since mid-19th century because it's easier to identify the underlying cause, and also for practical policing reasons. If we know for a fact that burglary would increase by 20% in the summer, then we need to target that. Whereas if that particular crime is non-seasonal, then we need to take different tactics to address those crimes. So assessing the seasonal resonance between different crimes and seeing which crimes tend to form hotspots at which season will obviously affect the police decisions and also long-term resource redistribution. Now, the short-term targeted patrols tend to rely heavily on seasonal projection, but very few studies existing on the seasonal resonance across many crimes. So we needed a new methodological framework for classifying the crimes by their seasonality and measuring the similarity and difference thereof. So this one, I'm afraid it's not an example from Chicago, it's actually from London. And here's the long-term trend of the ups and downs of crime counts from about 2014. 2013 to 14 was the time when they changed the classification method for crime types. So we can't really go back much further from here because the crime counts are different under different classes. Now, from 2014 onwards to about 2020, some crimes were stable, as in there is no significant growth. Other crimes had a bit of a dip, but it's been recently increasing. Others are steadily increasing, which is worrying, and so on. Yeah. Okay, so these are the 14 types of crimes that are typically recorded in the British policing record. And in terms of the similarity of their seasonal waves, then some of them have very similar pattern, others less so. Bicycle theft is the single outlier out there, but others tend to have some form of resonance with other types of crimes. And so this dendrogram shows us how similar they are and at what point they join with the other groups. Now, there's also a matter of the seasonal amplitude, as in how seasonal, how strongly do they fluctuate in terms of the seasonal pattern. And bicycle theft, unsurprisingly, is very, very seasonal. So this is because, you know, even in London, it tends to get cold in winter. It's not by Chicago standard, obviously, but if people see some white stuff on the street, they would scream in London. Yeah, that's the extent of coldness here. But anyway, during the summer, bicycle theft is rife. And the same can be said about antisocial behavior. During the summer season, there's lots and lots of activities, antisocial behavior. Typically, the young teenagers going to the pub and then gets upset because the pubs here typically closes at 11 o'clock. Anyway, there are some other crimes that are less peaky, but still seasonal. And these tend to either peak in the summer or in winter. And then there are vague peaks and so on. So we can then look at the similarity of peaks as well as the similarity of the wave shape. So, sorry, to go back, what we're looking at here is the similarity of the amplitude. So for instance, bicycle theft is very, very seasonal. It's the single most seasonal crime, which is why we have these peaks. But other crimes tend to have various peaks, and some of them are very weak, which is why drugs, shoplifting, robbery, and vehicle crime, they're sort of in a group, in a membership here, somewhere around there. Right. Compared to that, here we're looking at the similarity in their season. So if we combine those two dimensions, then we would be looking at whether or not there's a strong seasonality, as in strong peaks or weak peaks, and also whether they tend to grow in winter or increase in the summer. And interestingly, in this sort of multi-dimensional scaling, which is what we did here to represent the distribution of crimes, then the crimes that tend to be prolific in winter tends to have weaker fluctuation, and the crimes that tend to have very peaky, high amplitude, as in very strong seasonality, tend to become more frequent during the summer. This is still a work in progress, so we're not sure how to interpret this. And the Metropolitan Police Service told us that this is something that they already knew. So I'm not sure if there is any practical, substantive value to this, but we'll see. And we hope to apply these methods to crime cases from other cities, other places. At the moment, we're working with 3 local police forces and local government, and hopefully we can make some use out of them. Okay, so on that note, I think I've exhausted my time, and if you have any questions, I'd be most happy to take them. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Shiode, give excellent presentation about the new methods developed to detect these spatial temporal patterns of crimes. So now we open to the questions.
So I've stopped sharing.
Yeah. So I think one question I noticed that when you're showing like the different for the crime concentration for like at the very beginning, it's like a burglary and a robbery, and also one is a theft. So it seems that the robbery is more concentrated in the road across the areas. So that could be because of you use that network based methods. So then it's showing it's more concentrated in these crossroad areas.
Sorry, crossroad areas as in junctions.
Yeah, the junction areas. Yeah.
Right. Yes. It seems that crimes actually seems to statistically concentrate at the junction rather than the middle of the street. And I asked the police forces why that is the case. And they said, well, it's obvious because they have more pathways, more directions to get away if they're closer to the junction. So it actually is statistically true that crimes tend to happen closer to the junction. At least that's what I've been told. I don't know. I mean, if I was a criminal and if I was close to the junction, I might feel I'm more exposed to potentially more traffic, more witnesses. You know, if I was in a cul-de-sac, I might feel more, you know, safe, I suppose. But I don't know. I've never been in the mind of the criminal, so yeah.
I was going to say there's more ways to get away.
Right. So you actually thought right.
Could I ask a question?
Please.
Some of the attendees here are students in my politics of science and technology class, and we entertain the possibility that, and in Chicago there have been efforts to do predictive policing.
Mm-hmm.
Would you say that? How do you see these data being used for that? Could they be used for that? And what are your opinions about such a process? There was a strong effort to do it, and I don't know how things are going right now with that.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. Yes, crime prediction is something that we constantly look at, and it's also a very difficult topic. You're absolutely right. Chicago is at the forefront of crime prediction. These days, as you can imagine, we use lots of machine learning, whether it's SVM or random forest. We tend to use lots of machine learning, which means we look at the past crime data and then we train the computer program so that it gives an output of the likely prediction. And so that seems to be the norm in the arena of crime prediction at the moment. And yes, there's certainly scope for that. For the students, including my own students, they're increasingly tech savvy, and I constantly feel like I'm a big dinosaur. But so they tend to use lots of Google engines and so on, which already has these AIs and machine learning functions by default. So there's certainly scope for students to explore that. And I've been seeing some increasing number of dissertation, for instance, in the direction of not necessarily just crime prediction, but many types of prediction, including crime. So yes, that's definitely something that's coming up. I would say we always need to take a caution because if we just look at the past crime data and then try to predict the next step, then it may not be adaptable to something as prominent change as something like COVID. If the whole scene changes, then obviously the previous set of physics or whatever theory that's been the underlying base, that's no longer happening. So that changes, which then means we need to adjust for it. So if we were to incorporate some of these factors, external factors, and also there is an increasing effort to add some other elements, such as change in the weather condition. Obviously, if it's rainy, then that seems to reduce the number of crime. Whereas if it's cold but dry, that may not deter the criminals. So there are some additional factors that we could always feed into the model. So yes, it's definitely something that's happening.
Okay.
So how do you see, just now you mentioned those other factors, which one is important? Because you mentioned like weather, like the weather conditions, or maybe also the street conditions, because some street has more light and it's have like these surveillance functions or features than others. How did you see like these different factors? And also maybe economic, socio-economic, all these different, which one you think actually in your this research experience, which one you think is more significant or most significant to consider in the future?
That is a difficult question. It's an excellent question, but it's a difficult question to answer because we think things like the street light condition would certainly have bearing on the amount of crime or the risk of crime. However, in terms of actually capturing that data and reflecting that into the model, it's near impossible unless, we're talking about the smart city where we have almost a real-time understanding of which lights are broken, which light is a light, and so on. Similarly, if we were to capture the volume of pedestrians, if we know the traffic almost real time, then we would be talking about the number of witnesses potentially, and that tend to discourage certain types of crime. On the other hand, if there is a concentration of pedestrians, then some other types of crime, such as pickpocketing and so on, snatching, they tend to increase. So it's a tough one, and the pedestrian number ideally would be something that could affect, but again, it's very hard to get hold of unless we're talking about monitoring the smartphone usage or something, or Twitter, and use it as a proxy. And there are some attempts to do that, but again, they are very crude approximation. And finally, when it comes to socioeconomic status or demographic composition, then it's statistically true. If you look at different ethnicity, different religious groups, different income level, then there are certain crime rates associated with certain groups of demographics. But again, these are more static data because it's based on, let's say, a decadal 10-year census data. And if you think of trying to predict change in crime patterns on a day-to-day basis, then we wouldn't have access to the sort of demographic data day-to-day. And even if we did, it may not make much of a difference on the model. So that could be brought in as the sort of adjustable compounding factor to adjust the base, but it wouldn't really change the model, as it were.
Yeah, but based on that's very thoughtful answers. So I'm wondering, like, just based on your results, actually for Chicago, the most seasonal or the a strong signal is the bike theft. So it's possible, like since it's mentioned like a seasonality, so I just kind of think about like the seasonal job. So it's possible has some like correlation with the seasonal job. But since you mentioned that those data may not available like but it seems the seasonal job from the Census Bureau, they have the relative data, so it's possible to look at the relationship between these two to see besides like to allocate the police resources, maybe to see also some like a seasonal job can help reduce this related crime.
Yes, that is also another excellent point. So one other factor would be the sort of the impact of policing. If we ask the police force to add 5 more police officers in certain area and increase the number of patrols by 20%, for instance, then we need to measure the impact of that resource reallocation. And then we can see whether or not that changed the crime pattern. Now, unfortunately, police officers do not necessarily follow our advice. So even when we say, these are the high-risk areas and these are the emerging hotspots, it doesn't necessarily mean they would follow the instruction and say, okay, we'll patrol that area. No, they have their own mind, and they decide where to patrol. Also, the regional district superintendent would decide, no, your model might say this area is becoming riskier, but we have limited number of police officers, so we're not going to change anything. So, and then as a result, we would say, look, crime has increased. Or if they sent a certain number of police officers and if the crime number didn't change, then it's the case where we predicted correctly and hence the number of crimes didn't change. But then they would say, okay, so did that have any effect? And it's very difficult to, look at the impact of their police action, as it were. So it sort of touches upon a very sensitive topic and also something that's difficult to prove, which comes to the point where I'm comfortable doing crime analysis and sort of very near future prediction based on the projection, looking at the collocation of crimes, sort of resonance of seasonality. But when it comes to predicting something and then subsequently communicating that to the police force, then it becomes quite difficult to prove that we're actually saying the right thing because it hasn't happened yet. And once it happens, they might say, okay, we didn't send any police officers, but it didn't increase, so your model is wrong. Or it did increase, but not to the extent that you suggested, or, so it's quite difficult when it comes to, evaluating the outcome.
Oh, I see. I see.
Yeah, sorry, it was quite tangential to what you asked, but hopefully that gives you some ideas.
No, that's good to know. It's very, very insightful information because I didn't realize actually the police actually the authority department, they actually may not. But in that case, what information is they concern or care from this based on your collaboration with them? What are the information they actually most want to know?
Yes, so there are different groups of people in the police force, as you can imagine, as with many organizations. The people whom I work with directly are the ones who are looking at data analytics. They're the data scientists, so they value our input. But when it gets to the actual police officers at the forefront, they don't necessarily do data science. So that's where a bit of a confusion occurs.
I see.
Yeah.
That's good to know. Actually, it's kind of there's a little bit gap there. Research and also the policy implementations.
Right. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. So I think we already passed the time. So
Right.
thank you. Give a very insightful and excellent talk. Great talk. So usually we give applause to the speakers in the end. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh.